John 14, verses 1 through 6. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwellings. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So over the course of the last 25 years of ordained ministry, I've had a number of opportunities to be approached by people who are both in and outside the church, who are uncomfortable with what they perceive to be the Christian view of the relationship between Christianity and other faiths. Many have heard that, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes unto the Father except through me, and assume that means only Christians get in and everybody else kind of doesn't. Right? But many people these days know a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Jew or a Muslim and find themselves a bit shaken up by the fact that they seem to be deeply spiritual people. They seem to be on a spiritual path. They seem to be ethical and moral and all that, like Christians, sometimes more so, and they wonder how that can be reconciled. Also, people tend nowadays to maybe even fall in love with a Buddhist or a Jew or a Muslim who happens to themselves be Christian, or they have a son or daughter-in-law who is of a different faith, or perhaps their own son or daughter has decided to convert to another faith. And so take the example, for instance, of Dawn. Some of you know Dawn if you've read my book on the Phoenix Affirmations. But Dawn came into my church, my former church in Scottsdale, years ago, and he was struggling. You see, he had a daughter, an 18-year-old daughter named Carrie, and on her 18th birthday, they had all the family and aunts and uncles and grandparents and friends over, and everybody wanted to know what Carrie's future plans were. So she stood up and talked about how she wanted to, she was going to take a gap year to help some children in Guatemala, and then she was going to go on to college and major in engineering. And by the way, I'm converting to Buddhism. Well, that put a damper on this very strongly Christian family who attended a Bible church down the road from mine, and Don didn't know what to do. His whole family struggled for months. The parents, the grandparents, even the aunts and uncles tried to persuade Carrie to stay in the Christian fold. I mean, that it's the only way. It's the way, the truth, and the life. There is no other. And after they couldn't do it, then Don came in and met with his pastor. And the pastor said, "Well, bring her in, and I'll talk to her." But he talked to her, and still, no. Carrie was determined. She wanted to leave the Christian fold and become a Buddhist. And so then the pastor advised Don, said, you have, Carrie's older than her two, she had a brother and a sister, younger ones, and so, she has a lot of influence on them. If she goes Buddhist, then, you never know. If she's losing her salvation, your other two children might lose theirs as well. So, if she does not come back to the Christian fold, you really ought to think about threatening her with disowning her as a child. He said that might just open a crack in her heart large enough for Jesus to come back in. Well, Don wasn't so sure. He really struggled with this. I mean, on the one hand, he did worry. I mean, given his beliefs, he did worry about Carrie's younger siblings and what that influence might be. On the other hand, as a father, he felt instinctively like you got to love your daughter. You got to be with her no matter where she goes. And so he didn't know what to do, and he didn't feel like he could talk to his pastor anymore about this. And well, it just so happened that about a year earlier, he had heard that at my church in Scottsdale, we were holding a series exploring the connections between Buddhism and Christianity. And at the time, he had remembered remarking to friends like, this is just another sign of how Christianity is just sliding into relativism, right? But now he was curious. And so he made an appointment and came in. And he hadn't even sat down in his chair before he was challenging me. Like, you really believe that Christianity isn't the only way to God? And I said, I really do believe that. He sits down and says, well, how can you justify that? Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes into the Father except through me. And, he said that, but you could tell that the force of his conviction was more about the loudness of his voice, not the interior of the heart. He was struggling. His eyes kind of went soft and said, I have a personal reason for hearing your response. I have a daughter who I think might be going to hell. And so we talked, and we talked about what Jesus meant by that phrase. We talked about the relationship between Christianity and other faiths. We talked for quite some time about that struggle he was having, torn between loving his daughter and feeling like in order to love her, he had to somehow reject her at the same time. Well, if Dawn were sitting across the dinner table from you or in your office asking you, what about someone who converts to Buddhism, how would you characterize the relationship between Christianity and other faiths? What would your advice to Dawn be?
Don't you look at me so smug and say I'm always bad. Who are you to judge me and the life that I live? I know that I'm not perfect and that I don't claim to be. I know that I'm not perfect. Oh, 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 oh. Judge not before you judge yourself. Judge not if you're not ready for judgment. Oh, the road of life is rocky, and you may stumble too. So while you talk about me, someone else is judging you. Judge not before you judge yourself. Judge not if you're not ready for judgment. Oh, the road of life is rocky, and you may stumble too. So while you talk about me, someone else is judging you. Someone else is judging you. Someone else is judging you.
John 10, verses 1 through 5 and 16. Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hears his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. I have other sheep that do not belong in this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd.
Many years ago, my youngest daughter, Marin, who absolutely loves it when I use her name in sermon illustrations, and happens to be up on the balcony right now, she was driving home on Leavenworth Street and found a dog, this one, stray, seemed to be lost. And so she pulled over, brought the dog into the car, and brought it home, much to her parents' delight. And we called the Humane Society. They said, we'll put out the word about this dog, and if you like, you can bring it down, or if you want to keep it for a while, if nobody's claimed it by the end of the month, you can have it if you want, or just return it to us. And the dog, we already had a dog. It was a Doberman named Kita, but this little guy was awfully sweet, and Kita seemed to get along with him pretty well, and said, oh, yeah, we'll keep him around for a while anyway. And lo and behold, Kita, who had been ailing for a number of months, died during that month of cancer. And so, we had Ro. It's almost like Kita, once that other dog came in and said, okay, they'll be safe now, I can go. They're protected now. And really, we were, in some sense, we are better protected with Ro around than Kita. I mean, any intruder coming over our fence, seeing a Doberman, would certainly probably want to get back over the fence, but anybody who knew Kita knew that if you just held out a hand and smiled, she would become your new best friend. I mean, she was the most docile dog we've ever had. But Ro, however, he's more discerning about visitors. Let's just call it that. And he's an ankle biter. But but besides, there's just really, aside from that and one other characteristic, he's the perfect dog. So, you want to know the other characteristic? Well, you see, he's half Bichon Frise and half Jack Russell Terrier, as far as we can tell. And, that Jack Russell blood in him means that Ro, our dog Ro, is a ratter. That means he loves to go after little things, And he can dig around anything, and he can fit through holes that are just only slightly bigger than your fist. I've never seen anything quite like it. And if you've ever been to our house on 13th Street, there's a big brick wall that faces the street, but in the alley behind our house, it's just got a couple of wooden fences with gaps about 6 inches, which is quite easy for Ro to get underneath. So as soon as we determined that we were going to keep this little dog around for a while, I went straight to Menards and picked up a bunch of rock slabs and put it under the gaps of the fences, and proudly announced to Melanie, there's no way Ro's going to get out now, and headed off for work. Well, I opened the garage door, and there he was in the alley wagging his tail at me, which sent me back to Menards. I literally went to Menards 6 times, brought 6 different kinds of materials home, and was utterly humiliated 6 times. In fact, the last time it only took him 40 seconds longer to get out than the first time I tried to do this. So at wit's end, I finally skipped going to Menards and went straight to PetSmart, where I picked up a pet-safe wireless fence. So after stringing 200 feet of copper wire around our property, then we put on this little shock collar. Now, don't be shocked. It's a very light shock. It's about the equivalent of rubbing your feet on the carpet and touching something. That's all it gives you. But all it took was twice to experience that shock, and Ro no longer was so excited about digging under our fence. He just stayed within those bounds. But what was really shocking to us, though, was not that worked, but it worked so well that Ro actually grew to love his shock collar. Like he didn't feel comfortable unless the shock collar were around his neck. If it weren't, I could shake it to him, and he'd come running across the room, sit down, anxiously waiting for me to put that shock collar around his neck. It's kind of amazing how those things that which are familiar to us can be so comforting even though they imprison us, In this respect, dogs aren't that dissimilar from we human beings. I'm reminded of that film, The Shawshank Redemption, in which Morgan Freeman describes life in jail to a fellow prisoner. He says, these walls are funny. First you hate them, then you get used to them. Enough time passes, you get so you depend on them. That's institutionalized. That's institutionalized. Oftentimes, organized or institutionalized religion operates like a prison as well, or can, or an electric fence. If you threaten people that if they get out of line in some way, they displease God in some way, that God's going to basically zap them for eternity, you learn pretty fast not to cross those boundaries. And while those boundaries may seem a bit insane by some ways of judging it, the longer they're in place, though, you begin to get used to it. They become familiar. And they can then, you find all kinds of examples of people dwelling within those boundaries who grow to love those boundaries and even defend those boundaries, while we may look from the outside and say there aren't the same boundaries that you think there are. Well, when Don came into my office, we spoke about boundaries, but not his church's ideas of boundaries or even my own ideas of boundaries, but Jesus' idea of boundaries and the relationship between those who followed him and other faiths. Jesus talks about being the good shepherd and saying that I have other sheep that are not of this fold. And he even acknowledges that they're of other folds, but they already hear my voice. They recognize my voice, right? So if they didn't, they'd go running, but they do. So they're of their folds. What happens in a fold? I mean, the sheep come and they're safe. They're protected from the wolves and the thieves. If they're injured, the shepherd minds their wounds, and they have community with other sheep. They're safe in the fold. And if Jesus is saying, I have other sheep that are not of this fold, they're in other folds, they are safe in those folds, right? The only time you're not safe is if you go out and just kind of lose your way in the wilderness, and the thieves and the wolves are out there. But if you do lose your way, if you do exit the fold, what's God's response? Is it to zap you? Well, Jesus tells us what the response is, doesn't he? He says, if you out there, there are sheep that get lost. He says, God is like someone who, seeing one lost sheep, abandons the other 99 and goes looking for it, right? Jesus says, I lay down my life for the sheep. That's God's response. Somebody gets lost, somebody gets in danger of being hurt in some way, God's response is to help, not to hurt. I mean, it's not like these folds. I mean, these folds are meant to protect us from the predators and the thieves, not protect us from God. Right? And yet so many people in our own Christian fold seem to believe that these boundaries are essentially to protect us from God if we go outside of them. When I sat down with Don years ago, we talked about sheepfolds and good shepherds and boundaries like this, but looking back on it, I wish I would have done more than just talk about Bible and theology with him. Given a few more years of experience, I wish I would have asked a few more questions. Like, have you ever listened to Carrie? What is she seeking that doesn't seem like she's finding, or doesn't perceive that she's finding in her own fold? The soul, the human soul, given that we're all connected to God, you're hardwired, we are created in God's image and likeness. Deep down, our souls all know, without exception, that we are loved beyond our wildest imagination because we are hardwired to God in some way. And if the soul isn't finding that love, that compassionate love, that grace-filled love that loves you no matter who you are, no matter what you've done or undone, like a perfect parent loves, if that soul doesn't find that love, that soul becomes increasingly unhappy. And the soul also knows that it always is standing in the presence of the divine, that God is always around us. And so if the soul is not finding a community that is nurturing a connection with the divine and not putting one into some sort of personal relationship with God, the soul becomes increasingly dissatisfied. What was Carrie missing on a soul level that whether it was real or imagined, she was not finding in her community or faith community, perhaps even her own family or among her Christian peers? What were those things that she was missing? In the Christian fold, we have come to know a cross-shaped love. That's the central symbol of our faith, is a cross and an empty tomb. So to us, that's the beacon to the soul that assures us that yes, and reminds us that yes, the divine loves us, is self-giving towards us, would rather die even than to lose any one of us, and is constantly coming to us, offering us second chances, third chances, fourth chances, always seeking to restore any kind of rupture to a relationship. The cross is the beacon to the Christian soul. It's cross-shaped love. But do you think for a moment that that's the only way such love can be expressed or conveyed to other people? Jesus says, I have sheep that are not of this fold. They recognize my voice. So this cross-shaped love exists in other manifestations, in other folds. We know it through the cross. Other people know it by different means. But do you think for a moment that when a sheep gets lost, the shepherd says, well, unless you find this particular fold, you're going to be out there in the wilderness? Now, I advised Dawn that, if your family can continue to offer her this compassionate love, this cross-shaped love, and let her be free to explore. I mean, obviously, if she's thinking about changing religion, she's a soul in motion. She's a soul that's really concerned about the life of the soul. If you can keep loving her and let her feel free to explore, well, if she finds it in Buddhism, why not let her find it there? But, just as many of us find, sometimes the grass is greener, it looks greener in other pastures when it's far away, but when it gets closer, it's maybe not so green as well. So who knows? But certainly if Carrie was not finding what her soul needed in her own fold, then we know what Jesus' response is to that. He says, seek and you shall find. Ask and you will receive. Knock and the door will be opened to you. If you're not finding your own fold, seek, knock, ask, explore. The door will come open for you in some way that you can receive, whether it be in the Christian fold or another fold. God just has a way of coming to us, seeking us and finding us wherever we may be. Really, is that so shocking?